Hi everyone, welcome to this paper, Subatomic Racism, Microaggressions, and the Multiverse of Whiteness, which is as everywhere and discombobulated as it sounds. It was presented at the University of Suffolk's recent anti-racism conference as well. Through scholars like Jack Halberstam, Lauren Ballant, Stuart Hall, and others in queer and cultural studies, in 2023, I started to think about the ways popular culture might be used as a cipher for thinking about microaggressions and their devastating effects. I thought how the Ant-Man films, for example, could be a stepping stone for how racism warps realities. These fictions gave rise to six cosmic metaphors for racism's effects, infinity stones, controlling vital aspects of existence, time, soul, space, reality, power, so the body and the mind. This paper unites the stones as metaphor, hoping to yield more questions than answers. Physicists would describe subatomic particles as smaller than or within atoms. A subatomic world, in the Marvel sense, comes from the Ant-Man world of biochemist Hank Pym's Pym particle, and it is a world where you can shrink out of observable existence, where ideas of time and space become irrelevant. In the 70s, black psychiatrist Chester Pierce coined the term microaggression for the everyday isms black men and women experience in a post-civil rights America, while Arline Geronimus used the term weathering in the 1990s as well, so developing on that. In 2020, many of my colleagues, friends, and I in that summer of protests were finding the term microaggression had almost become a tick box absorbed into the shtick of equality, diversity, and inclusion, EDI, and stripped of its original context of effectively being death by a thousand cuts, as I've heard it described. And in that perfect storm of anti-racism protests and COVID-19, I was thinking of the Ant-Man stories and Stephen Hawking's definition of quantum mechanics, and came to think about a subatomic racism or a subatomic whiteness that came to define a localized terrorism that operates at a scale tinier than a virus, and really how racism warps realities. Einstein said that time is not the same for all of us, and yet while he was not talking about racism, Charles Mills's work on racial time might show where work in race and whiteness studies may meet classical physics, which became the basis of a paper I did called The Wretched of Multiverse as well, which was done in Leeds at their comics symposium at the library in Leeds. Fannin made links between racism and mental illness in his book The Wretched of the Earth, while PTSD was later found to impact perceptions of time, which is really where I made that allegory between racism and the time stone from the Marvel universe. So if racism impacts ideas of nowness, then by this definition, we might talk about ancestors in some cases as if they are still alive, including deceased grandparents. This is not to say that these are not also cultural practices, but I do think exposure to racism, at least for me, creates this feeling of longing. And this is where space and time intersect. Toni Morrison, for example, shows us that chattel enslavement was not only violent and exploitative, but also when it is supposed to be finished, it still haunts Black Britain and really many diaspora communities around the world. From talk of reparations to colonial statues, we are forced to coexist with the ghosts, as Avery Gordon calls it, haunting as inheritance. My own family history of chattel slavery in Grenada speaks to that, since my family name shows up in the UCL's digitization of the slave compensation records. In the MCU, or the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Toni Morrison's work might be read through Kamala Khan, Ms. Marvel, and how she slips through time into 1947 India during the Indian partition, much in the same way many of our elders can recall events like this as if they only happened yesterday. Moving into the space stone then, so the Tesseract, it manipulates the fabrics of space and opens portals between dimensions, and that's the simple version. What if we thought about racism's ability to connect us with departed ancestors that way? I know I've had such dreams. I think about consciousness and the link between our suffering now and ancestors' care over us. Alice Walker and Toni Morrison talked about this. Experiences of dreams might just be a way to talk to ancestors across space. Further, as practices that were passed down might just be source codes to the universe. By the block universe, does anyone really die? In existential physics, Sabine Hossenfelder tells us that this perplexing consequence of special relativity has been dubbed the block universe by physicists. In this block universe, the future, present, and the past exist in the same way. It's just we do not experience them in the same way. And if all times exist similarly, then all our past selves and grandparents are alive the same way our present selves are. How does this impact the mind? How does this impact the mind? I know for me, as an undergraduate student, I saw what I later found to be imposter syndrome after being told my work was terrible and to never make it, and I would never make it as an actual writer by my racist lecturer. What I later also soon saw to be gaslighting, because I knew my work was good and I've been told it was good. But again, I was made to doubt myself. Um, this shows up most brazenly in workplaces ruled by compliance cultures on abuse and really environments built on social terror. So, thinking about racism as subatomic and how it lodges itself in our cells and our nervous systems, it might even live in our subconscious. I began to think about how consistent exposure sends minds looping, which is how I came to think about entropy. In Christopher Nolan's film Tenet, entropy's relationship with time makes a barrier. Traveling backwards in time clashes with the laws of thermodynamics, but what they say is entropy is a closed object, which means time can only flow in one direction, forward. There are theories that challenge entropy or reverse it, which is what happens in Tenet. In Tenet, machines are being made that alter the direction of time for objects and people, in effect, mixing directions in the same scene. For example, while a bullet might be dropped from a hand onto a table, Tenet's reversing of entropy inverts the bullet, allowing it to arrive into your hand at your will. So lots of Tenet is actually a palindrome. It works the same going forwards as it does going backwards. So it was art, not science, and my own experiences that brought to me to racial entropy as a way for thinking about how racial gaslighting, I guess, simulates that time travel adjacent looping and experience, similar yet different to racial time. We might also see gaslighting as something that's lived in rather than an event level thing. Christopher Nolan argues we don't have to see cause and effect as one before the other. Could we think of racism that way as well? So you've heard about reality and time, space, and the mind, and I hope you've been able to follow my thoughts so far. Now we get to spirit and the soul stone. So, as a black person navigating modern Britain and country estates, I see the colonial blood splatter on the walls. There's been a big debate on diversifying country houses and our access to them. And I was asking, basically, just because you can, does that mean we should? Concurrently, we have a present reality of vast heritage sites where those questions of racism have been talked about in a physical sense and its mental effects, psychological effects, but not really as a spiritual project. So, what happens when I go to a heritage site or property and leave feeling wayward about the energies I've experienced there? Wealthy aristocrats who could have enslaved my ancestors and their spirits within the building. I came to think about this feeling as anthropomorphic whiteness, to articulate what I've absorbed from objects, castles, parks, gardens, churches, um, country houses, and really as sites as trauma. Can a space um, can a space empower certain kinds of bodies to do damage? For white women, especially, taking up space on these country house properties might be empowered by the spirit of whiteness on the walls to harm black staff and visitors, in the same way the pub can empower white men. In 1955, Guy Debord popularized the term psychodrography to describe the study of the specific effects of the geographical environment on the emotions and behavior of individuals. Mainly for myself, I was referring to this as anthropomorphic whiteness, really. Um, Anthropomorphic whiteness, to give words to how buildings, statues, and so on may be animated with that racist feeling of history, including gentrification, as much as it applies to country houses. It meshes English literature with whiteness studies. A feeling hangs in the air, and it's something that constantly shows up when we think about racism in historical spaces and that over and done withness. And all of this, um, and all of this warps reality as well. Warps reality, it warps space, time, spirit, mind, and it's all lived with and carried in the body. In the 2015, I believe, film Guardians of the Galaxy, Gamora says the Power Stone reacts to the reacts to organic matter like flesh. Um, the Power Stone was made to kill planets. Physicist Carl Sagan says the cosmos is also within us. We are made of star stuff, and we are waiting for the cosmos to know itself. In the disordered cosmologist Chanda Prescott Weinstein further tells us that Black lives are star stuff and Black lives matter every day, all of them. As the original people, this may be particularly relevant for Africans or people of African descent, and we would think of racism as in fact a star killer. Frantz Fanon further says something similar. If I am black, it's not the result of a curse, but it is because having offered my skin, I have been able to absorb all the cosmic effluvia. I'm truly a ray of sunlight under the earth. In Britain, we know black women and other women of colour are also at greater risk when it comes to fibroids, cysts, and breast cancer due to getting access to services later as their pain is not taken as seriously. But now we're still on the power stone here for the body. And when I interviewed my friend Susanna, she articulated her NHS experience of fibroids as a wall-to-wall medical gaslighting, further to how her fibroids were necessitated by racism at work. She got seen in early 2019 and having her child when the fibroids were not very big, and this was still going on 18 months later when they were 22 centimeters in length. Stressed white women get seen sooner because their pain is seen as legitimate. So the Power Stone reacts with organic matter, and ultimately it is a symbol for how racism reacts with the body, in Susanna's case, helping to give her fibroids. In today's paper, or this paper, I take the metaphor and extend it into the non-human and spiritual as a multiverse of whiteness. I gave the Infinity Stones an order just so it might be a bit easier to follow, but they don't need an order. Each stone compounds the others, and they work in tandem together. Thinking about the multiverse, it's a racism of many worlds: mind, spirit, time, reality, space, the body, which for sociologists might be better asked as what would Hill Collins and Crenshaw look like through a science fiction lens, but also taking it one dimension up to the unobservable. What I think of as a multiverse of whiteness thinks about the levels, working a bit like 4D chess. I'm really thinking on that idea of subatomic racism across six micro terrains for the stones as a development of Chester Pierce, since so many of my colleagues and friends just don't get along with that term anymore. Microaggression, that is. It's a racism working at a scale like at a millionth of an inch, space, time, and so on. And so on, and where how humans experience the world takes us out of the physical. Thanks very much for listening. And as always, if you've got questions and comments, leave them in the comment section or send me an email at tradeventour.com/contact.